There are gifts you ask for, and gifts you earn. But the one gift I wanted simple recognition was the one my family never gave. My name is Hadley Scott. I was the responsible daughter, the one who funded the perfect Christmases, while my brother Ethan was the one who got the praise. This year I learned he wasn't just taking the credit. He was planning to take my future. He saw my lifetime of sacrifice as a weakness he could exploit, a foundation for his entitlement. He was about to learn that the most overlooked person in the room is often the one who sees everything. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us.
The scent of roasting chestnut and sage was thick enough to chew on a heavy blanket of forced cheer draped over the Scott family home.
Outside, the early November dusk was turning the manicured lawn into a deep, unforgiving blue, but inside, the antique lighting, which I had personally had repaired last month, cast a golden glow over every polished surface. My mother Margaret called this ambiance. I called it a distraction. My hands were perpetually sticky with gravy and cranberry runoff. I was responsible for the turkey basting, the pie rotation, the place settings, and most importantly, though, only I knew it, the entire budget. The receipts for the heirloom centerpieces and the certified organic ingredients were tucked into the inner pocket of my apron. I had transferred the funds 2 weeks ago, cleaning out a significant chunk of my business savings account, the one I had established through 4 years of grinding independence, just so the Scott family Thanksgiving could maintain its standard. This was my self-sacrifice performed annually, and it was exhausting. "Hadley, darling, are you sure the music isn't too loud?" Margaret glided past the doorway, perfectly coiffed, her voice a low, melodious concern. She was dressed like a magazine spread, untouched by the grease and stress of the preparation. "It's the new seasonal playlist, Mom." I balanced the EQ so it's background noise, I replied, not looking up from where I was discreetly trying to scrape a smudge of soot from the oven door. "Oh, wonderful. Ethan says it's marvelous, so much better than last year's. He really has such an ear for these things, doesn't he?" I kept scraping. The music was the exact same playlist as last year. The only difference was that this year, Ethan had noticed it. And that, I realized with a weary internal sigh, was the core of my lifelong struggle. Ethan, my younger brother by 3 years, possessed an effortless magnetic charm that made every minor observation sound like a stroke of genius, and every small gesture look like a Herculean effort. My diligence, my actual financial and physical sacrifice, was merely the baseline expectation, the silent foundation upon which his recognized achievements were built. I found Ethan exactly where I expected him, sprawled on the oversized leather sofa, nursing a fancy cocktail and laughing loudly with Dad and a few early guests. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that I knew he hadn't paid for. His hair, always perfectly messy, looked like he had just stepped off a yacht. He hadn't lifted a finger all day, yet he was already soaking up the adoration. He was the favored child, the golden boy, and I was the dutiful elder daughter, the administrative assistant of the family experience. The favoritism wasn't a sudden, jarring betrayal. It was a slow, subtle, corrosive process. It was the way Dad Daniel would nod sagely at Ethan's half-baked business ideas, but dismiss my comprehensive 5-year plan for my graphic design firm as a nice little hobby. It was Margaret's gentle insistence during my college selection that I stay local to support the family, while Ethan was encouraged and funded to fly across the country to a prestigious and ultimately useless arts program. I felt the familiar hot pressure behind my eyes, a mixture of hurt and outrage that I had learned to suppress and transmute into efficiency. Dinner began a brightly lit tableau of Norman Rockwellian falsehoods. It was during the turkey carving, a task Ethan had dramatically volunteered for, that the betrayal started to sharpen into something dangerous. You know, Ethan's been pitching me a few ideas for expanding the old property portfolio, Dad said, slicing the breast meat too thickly. Brilliant stuff. A real knack for finance, our boy. Ethan smirked, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. It's just about leveraging the right assets, Dad. The Scott name still opens doors, especially downtown. We just need to divest a few less profitable burdens. I felt a cold prickle. Divest what exactly? I asked, my voice flat. Ethan didn't look at me. Oh, nothing you need to worry about, Hadley. Just the old Scott block of rental units on Maple. They're technically in your name, right? From that trust setup when Grandpa passed. We can use them as leverage for the new big development. Sell them off. Move the capital. It's prime real estate for a quick cash infusion. Think of the exposure we'd be in the big leagues. My fork clattered softly onto the plate. Those Maple Street units were not just an asset. They were the first investment I had ever made with my own savings, bolstered by Grandpa's small designated gift. A gift Margaret and Daniel had quietly ignored for years, assuming I'd never use it. Ethan knew this. He was proposing to liquidate my meager foundation for his opportunistic, unethical, big plan. A plan that, by the look of the sly calculation in his eyes, was designed purely to benefit him while exploiting a vulnerable asset. Margaret chimed in before I could respond, beaming at her son. See, Hadley, that's proactive thinking. You're so good at the details, dear, the planning and execution. But Ethan, he's the visionary. He sees the bigger picture. Dad merely nodded, completely blind to the fact that Ethan's vision was built on dissolving my property and that the big leagues usually involved cutting moral corners. My internal landscape shifted dramatically. The familiar sorrow and suppressed frustration curdled into something hard and sharp. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was being actively compromised. I forced a weak smile, excused myself, claiming I needed more ice, and headed toward the back hallway that led to the utility closet, my pulse thrumming against my ribs. I needed silence, a moment to breathe, and to think strategically, not emotionally. The hallway was dimly lit, and the utility closet door was ajar. As I reached for the handle, I froze. Ethan's voice, lower now, devoid of its public charm, drifted out from the closet where he must have taken a private call. Yeah, I know. Hadley is such a sucker, right? She practically volunteered to pay for this whole spread. Honestly, keeping her busy with the logistics is the cheapest insurance policy in the world. As long as she's running around making things perfect, she won't ask questions about the real money. She's too predictable. She hands us the gift and we just cash it in. The sound of his cold, genuine laughter echoed in the small space. It wasn't the sound of a grateful brother or a successful son. It was the sound of a predator congratulating himself on a successful hunt. In that moment, the pain of rejection vanished, replaced by a crystalline clarity. My long-suppressed need for fairness broke free of the emotional cage I had built for it. I was no longer a dutiful daughter trying to earn approval. I was an independent woman who had just been targeted, and I knew with absolute certainty that the battle for my future, and perhaps for the integrity of the Scott name, had just begun. He wanted to use my generosity for his gain. I would turn my strategic thinking, the details he dismissed, into his undoing. I waited until the last of the guests had wobbled home, the scent of expensive port lingering in the air like a heavy, unwelcome promise. Ethan was clearing his throat dramatically by the fireplace, waiting for Dad and Mom to praise his carving skills one last time. I cut him off before he could bask in it. Maple Street. I said, my voice low and steady as I stacked porcelain plates. Let's talk about the Maple Street units, Ethan. I need to understand why you think you can use my property as leverage for your development. He didn't flinch. He just gave me his practiced charming smile, the one that had deflected years of accountability. Hadley, don't be dramatic. It's for the family. It's sitting there generating pathetic rental income. I can multiply that capital by 10. You'll get a great cut. We all win. He leaned in his tone, dropping to a patronizing whisper. Look, you're good with the tiny details, the bookkeeping, the hostess stuff, but leave the big complicated transactions to me. You'd only mess it up. His belittlement stung, but this time the sting wasn't paralyzing. It was galvanizing. You think I'm too stupid to manage my own grandfather's trust? The only thing he set aside specifically for me? Ethan sighed, running a dismissive hand through his perfect hair. It's not about stupidity, Hads. It's about ambition. And frankly, a certain level of commitment. You never commit to the family business. You always have your own little side projects. His words weren't just about Maple Street. They were the echo of every casual dismissal I had ever endured. I saw flashes the day I graduated college, summa cum laude, only for Margaret to spend the entire celebratory lunch talking about Ethan's upcoming gap year abroad. The time I presented my business model to Dad, only to have him suggest I spend more time supporting my brother's aspirations. This wasn't a sudden conflict. It was the final inevitable break in a lifelong pattern of sidelining. The hurt that had kept me obedient finally broke, leaving behind a cold, controlled determination. I stopped talking to Ethan. I stopped looking for approval. Instead, I started gathering data. The small victories began almost immediately. Ethan's plan relied on securing preliminary financing from the first local bank before he publicly announced the Maple Street acquisition. I knew the bank manager, Mr. Peterson, socially. More importantly, I knew the antiquated, understaffed system of online permits and zoning checks in our small-town knowledge I had gained running my own independent firm. I spent the next 3 days after Thanksgiving hunched over my laptop in my apartment, running cross-checks on Ethan's shell company documents against municipal planning records. I wasn't just looking for fraud, I was looking for procedural vulnerabilities. I found a minor but critical lapse. A necessary environmental impact survey had been filed using an expired certification date. It was a technicality, but it was enough. I didn't confront Ethan. I didn't tell my parents. Instead, I anonymously submitted an inquiry to the Planning Commission phrased as a concerned citizen's question about the proper adherence to updated environmental certifications on all forthcoming commercial projects. The effect was subtle but immediate. Mr. Peterson, paranoid about compliance, placed a temporary quiet hold on Ethan's preliminary financing until the survey could be resubmitted. Ethan was furious, though he didn't know why. He blamed the bank's glacial pace and railed to Dad about bureaucratic incompetency. I merely watched a cold satisfaction settling in my gut. It was a tiny battle, one a clear sign that my perceived flaw, my attention to detail, was a formidable weapon. As the Christmas season approached, the community became my secondary theater of observation. Ethan was charming the local town council, and the more influential neighbors selling them on the grandeur of his fictitious development. I saw the social consequences playing out in real time. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet older woman who lived next to the Maple Street units, approached me at the grocery store, her face lined with worry. "Your brother says my property lines might be adjusted for the parking lot expansion," she whispered. "He's making it sound like it's already a done deal. I can't move, Hadley." The casual cruelty of his ambition, the way he exploited the trust inherent in a small town, cemented my moral position. This was bigger than my inheritance. This was about principle. I reassured Mrs. Henderson, promising to look into the official zoning map, but the interaction sealed my resolve. Ethan's downfall needed to be public, and it needed to be comprehensive. The family's annual pre-Christmas party was held at the town hall that year, a dazzling, crowded affair sponsored by my father's company. I wore a dress I felt strong in, but the feeling was tenuous. I saw Ethan making a beeline toward me, flanked by the mayor and Mr. Peterson, the very men whose hands he was trying to force. Hadley, there you are," Ethan announced, placing a proprietary hand on my shoulder, his voice loud enough to carry. "I was just telling the mayor how essential you are to the background operations of the Scott family." Honestly, she's a genius with all the administrative stuff, the filing, the invoices, the logistics of keeping us all running. She even keeps track of Dad's golf tee times. We'd be lost without her support." He paused, flashing a dismissive grin at the crowd that had gathered. "A true supporting actress, my sister." The air in the room seemed to go rigid. It wasn't a joke. It was a public declaration of my worthlessness in the family hierarchy, a stark, deliberate humiliation meant to undermine my independent professional identity in front of every important person in the town. My heart didn't break. It simply solidified into a stone. The insult was profound, calculated to remind me and everyone else that no matter my personal achievements, I would always be secondary to the visionary. I maintained eye contact with him, the blood draining from my face, but the clarity in my mind absolute. He had just drawn the line. He had forced my hand. I realized in that moment of deepest public shame that my quiet determination had to become loud. He wanted a supporting actress. He was about to get a star ready for her climax. Christmas Eve felt like the calm eye of a hurricane. The house was too quiet, draped in expensive tinsel and the scent of pine and anticipation. The tension was suffocating. I had spent the day putting the final meticulous touches on my presentation, not a holiday meal, but an accounting of years. The plan I had orchestrated was simple. Expose the truth in the most emotionally charged setting, forcing the issue of moral accountability onto my parents and pulling the rug out from under Ethan. I waited until the three of us, Ethan, Margaret, and Daniel, were gathered in the living room after dinner, ostensibly to open the big family gift. Instead of presenting the gift, I placed a slim, unmarked manila folder on the mahogany coffee table. "Before we do this," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, like ice, "I have a different kind of gift to give the family this year. It's called the truth." Ethan's smile faltered instantly, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Oh, for God's sake, Hadley, not tonight. Are we going to talk about the invoices again?" "No, Ethan. We're going to talk about integrity." I pushed the folder toward my parents. Inside are the documents detailing Ethan's plans for the Maple Street units. Specifically, the fact that he has misrepresented the property's current zoning compliance and has attempted to use Mrs. Henderson's adjacent lot as unverified collateral for his preliminary bank loan. Margaret was the first to react, her face hardening into protective denial. "Hadley, this is ugly. Ethan is working very hard to build a future." "Why are you always so negative?" Daniel avoided looking at the folder, choosing instead to focus on the fireplace. "Your brother is ambitious, Hadley. Sometimes business requires a little maneuvering." Their dismissal was exactly what I had prepared for the initial automatic defense of the Golden Boy. I bypassed their emotion and spoke purely with facts. Maneuvering that includes potential foreclosure for a 70-year-old neighbor, maneuvering that relies on me passively allowing him to liquidate the only independent asset I own, an asset he called a pathetic rental income, while bragging to his associate that keeping me busy with party planning was his cheapest form of insurance policy. Ethan exploded. "She's jealous, can't you see? This is pure pathetic spite because I finally found a way to utilize capital while she's still designing logos for boutique dog walkers." His face was flushed, the charming facade cracking completely to reveal the entitled fury beneath. He launched into a manipulative torrent, painting me as the bitter, underachieving daughter, trying to sabotage him out of resentment. I let him finish. I needed them to see the rage that Margaret's warm blindness had fostered, the entitlement that Daniel's distance had nurtured. When he finally paused, breathless and red-faced, I didn't raise my voice. I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto my parents, forcing them to look at the daughter they had consistently overlooked. "I am not doing this because I am jealous of his money," I said, the quiet intensity of my voice demanding attention. "I am doing this because I am weary of living in a family that values appearance over integrity and ambition over honesty. This isn't about a property deed. This is about the pattern." The emotional crescendo built. For 28 years, I have sought recognition that never came. I organized, I supported, I paid for, and I was dismissed. The gift I never got wasn't your approval. It was your honesty about who you saw and who you didn't. You saw a support system in me, Mom, a steady financial resource in Dad. You saw a visionary in him. I gestured toward Ethan, who was scrambling to regain composure. And you gave him permission to be cruel. He just publicly humiliated me last week. I continued, my voice trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the force of the restrained pain. And now he's planning to destabilize my financial independence and compromise the entire Scott name with an unethical scheme that relies on a network of lies. Daniel finally picked up the folder. His hands shook as he pulled out the environmental certification document, the one with the fraudulent dates and a printout of the preliminary loan rejection notice I had anonymously secured. The facts were irrefutable. Ethan, seeing the attention shift, made a final desperate power play. They'll never listen to you, Hadley. You're just relying on rumors and public records. My lawyer already filed the definitive paperwork this morning. It locks in the property acquisition for the project before the new year. You're too late. He smiled, a dark, triumphant expression. It's already a done deal. You can't stop me. But I had anticipated this final move. I looked at him not with anger, but with profound pity for his predictable arrogance. No, Ethan, you're too late. I reached back into my coat pocket and pulled out a single embossed legal document. I placed it on the table, not in front of my parents, but directly in front of Ethan. I didn't try to stop the acquisition, I stated calmly. I knew that would fail. I stopped the funding. The paper was a certified injunction. Days ago, using the evidence of his fraudulent zoning paperwork, I had worked with my friend Claire, a junior associate at a major firm, to obtain a court order. It wasn't an injunction against him selling the property. It was an injunction against the Scott Family Trust, guaranteeing the debt for the new development, citing material misrepresentation and unethical practices by the listed principal, Ethan Scott. The revelation was a full, crippling blow. Without the trust's guarantee, the entire foundation of his project collapsed instantly, leaving him exposed and financially vulnerable. His smile vanished. His face went white. Margaret gasped, clutching her chest. Daniel stood up, knocking his chair backward, his eyes finally wide with dawning horror, not at me, but at the catastrophe Ethan had just dragged the family into. The big plan was fully revealed, and the true threat wasn't Maple Street being sold. It was Ethan's reckless ambition, threatening the entire family's financial reputation, now laid bare before the only people who could impose consequence. The Golden Boy's standing had just been decimated by the administrative assistant. The moment Daniel Scott's horrified gaze lifted from the injunction and settled on Ethan, the fragile structure of our family myth collapsed into dust. Ethan didn't stay to fight. His face contorted into pure venomous shock, and he stormed out of the house, his expensive coat ripping a garland from the banister as he disappeared into the Christmas Eve night. Margaret was a picture of devastated denial. She tried to frame my actions as malicious as an overreaction born of old resentment, but Daniel silenced her with a look of defeated finality. He saw the cold, hard evidence, and for the first time in years, he looked not at the surface of his life, but into the hollow core of its moral compromise. The consequences were swift and catastrophic. By Christmas morning, the financial fallout was already a heavy pall over the small town. The injunction meant the bank pulled out immediately. Ethan was left holding the bag of a fabricated, unsalvageable development scheme, now saddled with significant personal legal fees and pre-planning costs. Socially, the damage was terminal. Rumors spread like wildfire through the holiday function's gossip about his fraudulent permits, his attempted leverage of old Mrs. Henderson's property, and the fact that his own sister had been forced to take legal action. The Golden Boy was suddenly revealed as a desperate, entitled snake. I watched it all unfold from my quiet apartment across town, initially experiencing a fierce, dizzying wave of triumph. Justice. Fairness. I had won the game they had forced me to play, but the victory quickly tasted like ash. It was a triumph built on the destruction of the family I had spent my whole life trying to earn a place in. The phone rang incessantly, but I only answered Claire Winters. She was my moral anchor, the one person who saw the years of quiet erosion. "You did the right thing," Hadley Claire said simply. "You didn't destroy him out of spite. You exposed his dishonesty before he could ruin more people. He was reckless and cruel. You were strategic and ethical." Her validation was the only thing that kept the guilt at bay. Yet the sorrow lingered. I grieved not for Ethan, but for the lost years, for the daughter who had constantly sought affection that was never freely given. I felt an intense lingering grief for the father and mother, who had been so blind, so willfully complicit in their favoritism, that they had created this monster and nearly sacrificed my well-being to sustain him. The triumph was hollow, because it confirmed the fundamental absence of true familial love. Later on Christmas Day, Margaret and Daniel arrived at my door unannounced. They looked exhausted, their expensive holiday clothes wrinkled and deflated. Hadley Margaret began, her voice tight. "We wanted to apologize. We realize we were wrong. Terribly wrong." Daniel looked directly at me for the first time since the confrontation, his eyes heavy with pain and regret. "We should have seen this coming. We were so busy trying to mold Ethan, we never saw what you truly were: independent, brilliant, and responsible. We made terrible mistakes." I listened, a cold, clinical part of me analyzing their words. Was this sincere remorse, or was it the consequence of public shame? A little of both, perhaps. Then Daniel made his final move of reconciliation. "We want to make this right. The trust will ensure the Maple Street units are secured under your complete management. And Hadley, we want you to come home. Come work with me. You've shown more business acumen in 2 weeks than Ethan has in 2 years. I need you to step into the family business. Properly. It's yours if you want it." The offer was the thing I had chased for: a lifetime approval, acknowledgement, and a legitimate place at the center of the Scott family. It was the gift I had never received, finally wrapped and presented. The wave of longing was powerful, an instinctual pull toward the warmth of acceptance. But I remembered the cold hallway, Ethan's gloating voice, and Margaret's instant defense of his deceit. I remembered the public humiliation. I had spent years trying to earn my place, and I had only received the offer once I had proven I could destroy them. My moral agency, my self-worth had been hard-won through painful independence. To step back now would mean trading my hard-earned clarity for a position in a toxic ecosystem. I looked at my parents, seeing them not as gods of my youth, but as two deeply flawed, desperate people. My choice was excruciating yet clear: accept a reward from the system that broke me, or maintain the boundaries that saved me. I inhaled deeply, feeling the sharp, clean edge of self-determination. "Thank you, Dad, Mom," I said, my voice steady, though my heart ached with lingering grief. "But I can't come back. I need to be independent of the Scott name, not dependent on its guilt." I had to make the ultimate personal choice to establish a permanent boundary for my own well-being, accepting that the price of self-respect was the loss of the traditional family I had always desired. My future demanded a path carved out of my own strength, not handed to me out of regret. The healing could only begin once I put myself first. The door closed behind my parents, leaving a profound final silence in my small apartment. I stood alone in the hallway, not crying, not shaking, but simply breathing. The act of rejecting the olive branch, rejecting the role they had finally conceded was mine, was the single most definitive moment of my life. It was a cold, hard choice that bought me my freedom. The loneliness I felt was real, the sharp price of cutting away the toxic influence, but beneath it lay a bedrock of immovable, self-determined peace. The weeks that followed were filled with the quiet, necessary work of resolution. I formally secured the Maple Street properties, not just in my name, but locked behind a trust designed to protect them from any future visionary in the Scott family. Ethan had vanished from town, pursuing some vague, desperate scheme elsewhere, his reputation here ruined. My parents were left to manage the fallout, the forced reckoning of their own complicity, and the slow public realization that their favoritism had only fostered weakness and dishonesty. The story was over, but the life had to begin. I didn't participate in the traditional Scott family New Year's Eve gala that year. Instead, I hosted my own small celebration. I called it a belated holiday gathering, and the guests were the bonds that truly mattered: Claire, my moral compass and legal ally, and Mrs. Henderson from Maple Street. The scene was the antithesis of the Scott mansion. My living room was small, lit by soft string lights, and warmed by the scent of cider and real unforced laughter. Claire brought wine. Mrs. Henderson brought a simple handmade quilt. It was a victory celebration disguised as a dinner party. "You've changed," Hadley, Claire noted, raising her glass. "I mean, you've always been strong, but now you're untethered." I realized my entire life was spent trying to prove I was worthy of their acceptance, I admitted. But the moment I stopped looking for their approval, I found my own worth. The gift I never got was the chance to be seen as my own person. I had to take that gift for myself. This was the central truth I had learned. Empowerment doesn't come from inherited position or a parent's acknowledgement. It comes from moral courage in the face of betrayal. It resonated with the deep American cultural value of rugged independence, not in the sense of financial greed, but in the belief that one must forge their own ethical path, free from the constraints of a flawed heritage. I had spent so long being the diligent daughter, the supportive sister, that I had forgotten how to simply be Hadley Scott, the creator of her own destiny. The resolution was bittersweet. I grieved the idealized family Christmas, the warmth I had perpetually chased, but the sorrow was overshadowed by the profound satisfaction of self-determination. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had merely excised the rot that threatened to destroy me and my true moral community. For the final symbolic gesture, I stood in front of my own small Christmas tree long after Claire and Mrs. Henderson had gone home. Instead of the lavish, expensive gift I would have bought for my parents and Ethan, a gift intended to earn my worth, I had used the money to pay off the final installment of Mrs. Henderson's mortgage, securing her freedom from any future predatory schemes. I picked up the small brass candlestick that had belonged to my grandfather, the man who had given me the Maple Street Trust, the only member of the family who had truly championed my independence. I lit the plain white taper, watching the small flame bloom in the dark room. The light was small, unassuming, but it was honest. It was mine. I stood there, feeling the warmth on my face, reflecting on the woman I had become, not the bitter daughter, not the administrative assistant, but the architect of her own integrity. The revenge was complete, not because Ethan was ruined, but because I was free. I had reclaimed my name, my property, and my self-respect. The final emotional catharsis washed over me, a quiet, powerful sense of having earned my peace. The candle flickered, signaling a new year and a new path, defined by my own boundaries and my own courage. The past was a closed book, and the future was a clean blank page, finally ready to be written by me. And with that quiet, self-determined act, Hadley Scott finally closed the door on the gift she never got, choosing peace over a toxic legacy. What did you think of Hadley's final decision to walk away? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single thought you share with us. If you enjoyed this story of justice and boundaries, please subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.